Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Archives.com live stream. I'm Amy Johnson-Crow. This week our topic is beginner mistakes and how to avoid them. It seems that there are some common mistakes that people make when they're first getting started climbing their family tree. And admittedly, some of these mistakes are mistakes that people will make even after they've been doing genealogy for a number of years. Sometimes we just get so excited and it's easy to fall into some of these common pitfalls, some of these common traps. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, some of these beginner mistakes and how to avoid them. Probably the number one mistake that people make when they're first getting started in genealogy is they get hung up on the spelling. I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard this. That can't be my ancestor. The name isn't spelled right. Well, if you're ignoring some records just because the name isn't spelled the way that you think it should be spelled, you might be missing out on some records that actually pertain to your ancestors. Some things that we need to consider why the spelling would be different than what we would expect. Well, there was a high rate of illiteracy, and people didn't necessarily know how to spell their own name. They would spell it like it sounded, and people would write down names as they heard them. So if you have a combination of people who don't know how to spell their own name combined with poor handwriting, is that an I? Is that an E? Is that an R? What are these letters? I really don't know. And then you also have the problem of accents. If you have a person who is, say, a German immigrant or an Italian immigrant, and perhaps they're speaking with a thicker accent than what the person writing down the record is expecting, and perhaps they're not familiar with some of the spellings or some of the sounds that are from that other language, it can really make a big difference in how names are recorded. So we really need to get out of the mindset of there's only one way to spell a name. My last name is Crow, C-R-O-W. I can't tell you how many times my last name has been misspelled. And it's only a four-letter word. It's only 4 letters. How can you misspell it? Well, think about it. What's another common way of spelling Crow? Well, a lot of people spell it with an E at the end. That's not the way that I spell it. But as I'm doing research, I want to keep in mind that somebody might have tacked on an E at the end of the person that I'm researching. So I really need to keep that in mind. One of my favorite examples of how different names can be spelled for just one person is a man who I've been researching, and his name is Christian Daubenmire. Born in 1835, died in September of 1900. Well, on his tombstone, his last name is spelled Daubenmire, D-A-U-B-E-N-M-I-R-E. In the 1900 census, which was taken just a few months before his death, you can see that the spelling is quite different. Daubenmire, D-O-U-B-M-I-R-E. And it's different in the 1880 census. It's different in the 1870 census. He has a different spelling in the 1860 census. Now instead of D-O-B or D-A-U-B, it's D-O-V. And on his marriage record in 1855, it's again D-O-V, but the ending is spelled differently. So Christian Daubenmire has so many different ways of how his name was spelled in different records. And again, it's going to depend upon who is creating the record. How did that person hear the name that was being said to them? And it's entirely possible that Christian himself didn't have a set way of spelling his last name. So what can we do to avoid this whole spelling issue? Well, the first thing we can do is be flexible. Don't get hung up on one particular name, that it has to be spelled that way, otherwise it's not the right person. Be flexible. Play around with spelling. Think about your own last name, and again, how many different ways that other people have spelled it. So take your ancestor's last name and just start playing with, if someone said this name to you, how would you spell it? And play around with that. See how many different ways you can come up with spelling that name. Also, sound out the name, including with accents. If you are researching someone of German ancestry, sound out that name with a heavier German accent, or with an Italian accent, or a Scottish accent, whatever ethnicity that ancestor would have been. And see if that makes a difference in how that name might be spelled. Thinking about Christian Daubenmire, well, if I sound that out with even a slightly thick German accent, it's pretty easy to lose that N, Daubenmire. But if I pronounce it, more guttural as Daubenmire, it's pretty easy to drop that second syllable and it becomes Daubenmire. So sound out the name. Also, write out the name and see what letters could be misread. And this makes a difference if you're looking at records that are going to be indexed, or that have been indexed. Because if the person indexing that record misreads it, it could make a difference on whether or not you find that record later. So write out the name and see what letters might be misread. Another common mistake that beginners make, and again, this is a mistake that even people who've been doing genealogy for a while make, adding a record too quickly. Get all excited and wow, that's the person I'm looking for, so I'm going to add this record to what I know about this ancestor. This happens sometimes when we focus too much on the ancestor's name, and we don't look at other clues in the record that could confirm or refute the fact that this record does or doesn't apply to our ancestor. So let's say that I'm looking for Stanley Johnson in the 1920 census in Ohio. Well, there happen to be 36 of them. So what am I going to do? Just scroll down. It's like, oh, well, that Stanley Johnson looks good. I'm just going to attach this record. I'm going to say, hey, yeah, this one's mine. No, what we want to do is take a look at other clues. I have to look at something besides his name. What other clues in this record could tell me whether or not it's my Stanley Johnson? After all, I don't want a record for just any old Stanley Johnson in 1920 in Ohio. I want my Stanley Johnson in 1920 in Ohio. So what can I do? Well, I need to slow down and look at something besides the name. Look at other things that are in the record. If I know his birth date and birthplace, I can start comparing those. Same with death date and death place. Let's say that I'm looking through death records and I already have an idea of when and where he died. Perhaps I've seen his tombstone before. I can compare that information. And also looking at who else is associated in this record. This is especially good when you're working through the census because you can take a look at other people in the household. So I can look at the spouse, I can look at children. If he's older, I can look at his parents, look at the siblings. I can just look at the people that are associated with him that I know about from previous research and compare it to what that particular record is telling me. So it's not enough to look just at the name. We really do need to take a look at these other facts before we say, yes, this is the right record. Associated with adding a record too quickly, something that it's really easy to do, and that's jumping back too quickly. I see this happening a lot in the census. We find an ancestor in the census and we want to go back to the other country. We see that he's born in another country and we want to start researching there. Or we find him as a spouse in the 1920 census. So immediately I want to go back to the 1860 census and try to find him as a child. Well, there's going to be some problems with that, because if we go back too quickly, when we find that record and we start looking for other records, we might not have enough information to really do that. As I was talking about, when we add records too quickly, we need other information besides the name. So we really need to take a look at what that one record is telling us and research a little bit more before we make a huge leap backwards. For example, let's say here in the census, I have found John Corrigan, and it tells me that he's 56 years old and that he was born in Ireland. So it's really easy to be tempted to just start going and looking in Irish records looking for John Corrigan. Well, if you do that based on this one census record, you're going to end up with a lot of frustration because you just don't have enough information to make that leap. So what can we do? What can we do to avoid jumping back too quickly? Well, again, slow down. The records aren't going anywhere. Work from the known to the unknown. And if all you have is that one census record, that's what you know, that's not enough to really take you back to the unknown. So what you need to do is gather all you can where you know the person was. That includes looking at them in all of the censuses that you expect to find them. Look for all of their vital records. Look for their obituaries. Research everything you can think of before you make that leap back to another place, or if you're skipping several decades back in time. Just slow down and gather everything you can where you know that person was before you make that leap. And another big mistake is focusing only on the direct ancestor. It's easy to have blinders on because that's our ancestor. That's really our focus. That's who we want to find out more about, so it makes sense to focus just on that person. Well, if we do that, we're going to be missing some great clues from other people, such as their brothers and sisters and their neighbors. Here we have the Kirby family, and living in the household with Harry Kirby is his grandfather, Theodore Aubach. And it says here the relationship to the head of household is grandfather. Well, let's say that your direct ancestor is Harry's brother John. Well, if you skipped doing just a little bit of research on Harry, you're going to miss identifying the grandfather. The grandfather is only going to be living in one household in that census. And if he wasn't living with your direct ancestor, but is living with one of the siblings, you really need to just slow down and look for those siblings because they could have some really great clues for you. And also take a look at the neighbors. Now here we have a 1860 census. We have Leroy Hamsfar. And look who's living next door. Now Leroy's age 32. Living next door is Mary Hamsfar, age 54. Along with 30-year-old Charles Hamsfar and 26-year-old Mary E. So I don't know what relationship, if any, there is between 32-year-old Leroy and 54-year-old Mary, who's living next door. But wow, what a clue. The ages certainly fit that Mary could be Leroy's mother. So if I had focused my attention solely on Leroy. And I didn't bother to look next door or on the same page or the page before or the page after and see what other Hamsvars are living nearby. I could have missed this clue. Now, again, this one thing isn't telling me that Mary is Leroy's mother. But again, it's a very good clue. She's living next door. The age is right. So it at least gives me something else I need to research. I really want to take a look at this Mary Hamsvar and learn more about her and see what connection there is to my Leroy. Also, I want to take a look at this 31-year-old Alexander Price and 31-year-old Carolyn Price, who's living with Leroy and Mary. Could this be either Leroy's sister? Could it be Mary's brother? Could it be Mary's sister? I don't know. They might not be any relation at all. They might just be sharing the same house. It's completely possible that they're not related. But they're living in that same household. I want to take a look at them and learn more about them to see if there is a relationship. I really need to take a look at these neighbors. So, how do we avoid the blinders? How do we avoid focusing so much on our direct ancestor? Spend some time researching the siblings. If you've identified those siblings, perhaps from the census or from obituaries or probate records, take a little bit of time to research them and pull out clues from their records. And also look around at the neighbors. If you're working in the census, make sure that you take a look a couple pages before, a couple pages after you find your ancestor. See what other people in the neighborhood share that same surname or that have some characteristics in common with your ancestor that could give you some good clues. Again, it's a matter of slowing down, taking your time, and seeing what else is around there. All right, next week on the archives.com live stream, we're going to talk about finding your ancestors in the census. We're going to take a look at some strategies for identifying them, for actually searching them, and getting good clues. So again, next week, October 16th at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, be sure to stay connected with archives.com, whether it's on our blog, liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter, or watching our previous live streams on our YouTube channel. And if you're watching this later on our YouTube channel, I encourage you to join us live on Wednesday afternoons or Wednesday morning if you are in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, 1 o'clock Eastern, joining us on the live stream as they're going on, joining us in the chat room. We have good Q&A afterwards and some really good interaction there. So until next week, I'm Amy Johnson Crow, wishing you happy researching.